Hello, this is Morgan Freeman, and I want to thank you so much for all the ways that you support my friends on The Edge with Mark Thompson. You know, you can listen on iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, iHeartRadio, and many places that great podcasts are heard. That's an oxymoron, by the way. Great podcasts. You can go to their website, edge-show.com. Well, still haven't purchased a new domain name, I see.
You're listening to The Edge with Mark Thompson.
Hi, it's Mark. Welcome to the show. We've got David Dayen from the American Prospect on talking about the rescue package. David breaks it down so it's easy to understand. You see how it is a huge corporate gift. And at the low end of the gifts, I mean, really, like the end of the trough comes the average American. But the specifics you will find galling. And David lays it all out, the American Prospect. Michael Shure will kick us off talking about civil unrest in America, talking about COVID-19, and talking about the upcoming election. We digress into areas all along that way, and Michael is the best. We don't pound on you for support except for the 5-star reviews. We appreciate you for that, but don't worry about sending us money. Still, if you can support us by doing your shopping, if you're going to shop on Amazon, if you're going to do it anyway, go through our website, edge-show.com. We get a little piece of whatever you spend. It's the same Amazon as normal, but we get a little piece, and it helps keep the lights on here at the show. Otherwise, these are tough times, so I don't really pitch as hard for financial support. All right, that's what's going on. Let's get started.
This is The Edge.
The advantage, it means.
Hey, look, I just spit on me for no reason.
That's horrible.
Is there some comfort in uncertainty, do you think?
You're a degenerate.
Because Australian Shepherds need action.
Wow. Yeah.
This is The Edge.
That's a self-loathing term that I use.
Oh, got it.
Subscribe to The Edge on iTunes or on Stitcher.
Michael Shure, everybody.
Thank you, God. It's good to be here. It's good to be here. Would like to be out of the house, Mark, I got to tell you.
Well, they're loosening things in California where you live. That's
Yeah, they are. I mean, but again, I think it's going to all get tightened back up again. I mean, that's just me.
Well, that's clearly the case. I mean, I say clearly the case because you're going to have a spike. You know, you're going to have a spike in cases. What's that? CNN what?
No, I said that's me, and it's also Anthony Fauci. So.
Yeah, that's right. Anthony Fauci says the same thing. But I'm really excited that the president's rallies are going to get back to, you know, I mean, they got to get those back on track. I mean, we got to have some priorities in this country, you know.
It's the thing I've missed most, I guess.
Once we get those rallies going again, we can forget about the fact that America's cities are on fire, that there was looting, there's institutional racism, various police departments, that there are calls for defunding / reworking / reforming these police departments, and that there's this COVID-19 pandemic that has killed upwards of, what are the latest figures? Over 110,000 Americans.
That's correct, yeah.
But I think if we get the rallies going, I think people can all kind of get on board. It's kind of like going to a great escapist film. You know what I mean? Hate on the Democrats, hate on the liberals a little bit, and you know what I'm saying? It takes your mind off of stuff.
Right, and talk about what a great job the president's doing. So you get
exactly.
it all in one.
Thank you.
I think I'm getting A+.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, that's a top grade.
He handled COVID at a 10 out of 10, right?
No.
Hunter Walker asked him to grade him. He said, I give myself a 10 out of 10.
Wow, that's really good.
And this is their new hoax, the coronavirus.
Yeah, the hoax is really good, though.
Right.
I have to say, as hoaxes go, this is strong.
One of the best orchestrated.
Yep. So I don't know where to start, which is typical for me.
Well, I also think, Mark, this is such a haphazard news, politics, cultural awareness time that nobody knows where to start, and that's the problem.
Well, I'm going to start with this situation with so many American cities having seen protests, and I say cities, I mean, it's communities everywhere, small towns even. And they weren't just black faces that you saw, people of color who were protesting. There were white communities where it was nothing but white faces. I mean, clearly this is a desire on the part of people to say, hey, we recognize something's wrong here. That's what I got from all of it.
And it has to be taken seriously. I mean, I'm sure that there are skeptics who look at the white crowds, black and white skeptics who look and say, oh, it's just people putting on window dressing and doing it because they feel like they ought to, and to take selfies and spread them that they were at a protest in Saginaw or Tucson or wherever it was. But the point is that that's how it starts, you know, and you have to cut through that to get to the people that are really there because they're really concerned and really upset about the status quo. And I think that's the important takeaway from this, as these protests had to go on past the looting because the looting took away from what they were trying to do initially. The protests had to survive the looting, and they have very successfully done that.
You mentioned the looting. I just want to touch on that for a second before I get to the defund the police thing. The looting, it was suggested by some, was the result of a subjugation of an entire community, an entire group of people, to the point that they have economic deprivation on a level that makes them, in a sense, and this was not the word used, but I heard this argument a lot, entitled to, or it's a release such that they want to loot. I did not get that. I thought in large measure there were younger people, who were doing the looting. And there are a lot of people who are out just for, the fun of it. And really, when you looked at who was involved in the looting, it didn't seem to be those who might reflect that kind of subjugation that I just described.
Yeah, it was totally opportunistic, and it was totally unrelated to the moment. Burning down the police precinct is different than going into private businesses all over America. Burning a police car, statements against the police like that is the kind of looting that is informed looting, whether you agree with it or not. There's something that is connected to what's happening around that kind of looting. But going into stores in cities all over America and taking stuff and then stopping a few days later because you got all you needed and the wooden boards went up, that has nothing to do with the cause. But yeah, I agree with you, Mark. I think it's totally disconnected.
I'll also say, just because we're talking about looting, that the biggest looting of the U.S. Treasury took place by corporate America and the economic elites. I know it's almost a cliche to say it. And later in this episode, we talked to David Dayen about just this thing. You see how government is being used to loot the Treasury in so many different ways. He's got a lot of details. It's really a fascinating conversation, and that'll follow this one.
And that's great, and David's brilliant, and I think it's important that take is taken. And to say it's a different kind of looting sounds condescending, but that is a systemic problem with the way that government is run and bureaucracies are run, and it's not untrue. But I don't think that in comparison it's entirely comparable in comparison to something horrific that happened in America that the country as a whole was responding to and then got sidetracked by this thing that went on for a matter of days. The looting that David writes about has been going on for decades, and it's inexcusable and needs to be addressed. But it is a little different and I understand why people were comparing it, and people who wanted to defend the looters say, hey, the government's doing it forever. They're not entirely wrong, but it is different because it is taking the attention away from something really, really important, unwittingly doing it, but it certainly did it. And that's why the fact that the protests continued is so important, because the aftertaste of all of this is the protests. The aftertaste is the death of George Floyd. I think a very small aftertaste is the looting now.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I mean, all those points are good. I also would say, just on the looting involved with the protests that then got, as you suggest, opportunistically exploited by those who wanted to loot, you see a lot of small businesses being looted. So you're not, the corporate looting, in quotes, of the Treasury that I talk about. That's not the small business people who are suffering such loss that they may not be able to continue in business as a result of the looting that occurred during those 4 nights of mayhem that affected so many American communities. So you really see small businesses victimized, by all of that as well.
And what you said is further confirmation of the fact that this was totally disconnected from any kind of causal reaction that Floyd took on. Because if it was thoughtful in the least, it would have A, thought about George Floyd and the police killing, and B, would have realized that the people that they were looting were people, who were hardworking Americans in most cases, small business owners in most cases, or in many cases, and people whose livelihoods depended on these stores being open. So it was thoughtless mayhem.
The message of defund the police, which is now being talked about as a bad slogan, I've mentioned before, I think it is a problem. I don't see it as clear messaging. It's also talked about as something that's easily weaponized by the opposition, by those who want the status quo. Look at the Democrats. They want to take away your police department, this sort of thing. Quickly, I want to touch on that, and then I want to talk about legitimately we can be done. So defund the police. Problem?
I mean, it's a problem if it's articulated that way all the way. I mean, Joe Biden responded to it pretty quickly. It's defund the police as we know them, fund the police, right? I mean, it's you have to get reform before you can just keep throwing money at them. So it's not a let's break up the police for most people who believe this. It's a terrible slogan. Abolish ICE was a terrible slogan. They attempted to weaponize that against Democrats in the 2018 midterm elections, and it didn't really go anywhere in light of the immigration, the caravan scare, if you can recall that, so many decades ago it seems, but it was fewer than 2 years ago, where the president was talking about a caravan of immigrants coming up, and the Democrats wanted to abolish ICE. No, they wanted to change ICE. They wanted to not lock people up in cages. They wanted to make sure that there were reforms that abolished ICE as we know it. So defund the police is easily weaponized. However, it's only weaponized if the Democrats who are being accused of employing that position don't fight back. And immediately Joe Biden, who is the nominee of the Democratic Party, said, no, I don't want to defund the police like that. We need major reform. I think it's easily answered, but, not at a Trump rally, and you'll certainly hear it a lot.
The notion of institutionalized racism, that the legacy of slavery and the horrors of generations being visited upon our culture constantly and sort of, it seems like such an intractable issue. It's clearly institutionalized, yet there's such denial and pushback. Larry Kudlow, who's the president's economic guy, he was out there, he said this.
Most of my adult professional life, I not only have fought for equal rights, including civil rights, but I don't believe nowadays we have systemic racism. We do have some bad apples in the police department, and that can be changed.
So system is okay, but it's just a few bad apples.
Well, I think what we're learning about policing is that we've got some good apples in the police department, but they're the rare birds, it seems, as we've seen. And I'm not singling out people here. I mean, you had 57 members of the Buffalo Police Department applauding as two of their members were sprung from arrest yesterday, or 2 days ago, or 3 days, whenever it was, after that horrible thing of the 75-year-old man being pushed over and bleeding from his ear. You see just the way that the police stick together. You see the way that they stand by while one of their colleagues has a knee on someone, killing them for 9 minutes. So I think I would say that within the police department, thank goodness there are a few good apples. And I don't mean that to be provocative. I think that's what we're seeing right now, and that has to change. So the systemic racism that Kudlow says doesn't exist, or he doesn't think it exists today, the whole idea of it being systemic means that we are now pulling the curtains off of it now, so you can see that it really does exist. It's the most tone-deaf thing I've heard a high-ranking official say in a while, because Larry Kudlow's smart and he's thoughtful. Even if you disagree with every thought he has, he's a thoughtful person. It so also speaks to the fact that a certain type of American lives without realizing it, nor should they always realize it. They're not the ones affected by it. But these same Americans should be sensitive to the fact that the people who say that it exists, who live it every day, have a leg to stand on that he doesn't have here. And they're the victims of systemic racism. And I would say it's unfair to say it doesn't exist unless you have been a victim of it.
I mean, if you look at society across the board, it seems undeniable that it exists. I mean, the redlining of black families, the inability of blacks to rent and live in the same places as white Americans, just on that alone, you can see how it's baked in. And then you look at
and black Americans are the only people that were brought here as slaves legally. Like, that was allowed, and they were brought here as slaves. There are sex slaves brought in. There has been indentured servitude. There have been slavery in many forms, but it was always swept under the rug or hidden. Sex slavery, as we know, is. But these people were brought here. Many generations of black Americans were owned people. You can't just shake that with an Emancipation Proclamation. That's why people talk about reparations. I mean, Governor Andy Beshear in Kentucky, a Democratic governor this week, said that he wants 100% of African Americans covered with health care. That's how you start. That may seem extreme to some people. He said 99.5% is not enough. 100%. Why? Because they don't have the same ability historically to move into a sector where they can get the types of jobs that come with healthcare. They can get the kind of education that leads you to a job that comes with healthcare. So this systemic racism, it exists until it doesn't exist. So Kudlow could not be more wrong.
And you may say, well, after the Emancipation Proclamation, I mean, didn't things improve? Actually, not really so much. I mean, sort of, but what was a culture of black subjugation and black oppression in the South continued. They were given nothing as a group of people to allow them any chance to move on. There was no vertical movement because it was essentially, and this is the systemic part, the system was essentially kept in place. I mean, okay, right. You're free. What are you going to do? You're going to work on my plantation is what you're going to do.
Yeah, and you're right to talk about the system. I mean, certainly it was better. The Emancipation Proclamation outlawing slavery was better. The same way the Civil Rights Bill was better. Was there greater order in the South in the 50s and 60s? There may have been. And people look back at it, and white Southerners look back at it and say, you know, it was a lot more orderly, and there was a lot less, you know, tumult, and there was a lot less blatant poverty, and there were a lot less homes that turned into tenements and areas that were blighted. But that's not the point. The point is black people couldn't vote, and black people couldn't sit in the front of the bus or in the downstairs portion of a cinema. So you have to take some bad with what is essentially good, but it doesn't mean the racism goes away, and it doesn't mean the system that has survived knowing a way to go, a way to exist. I mean, you hear people say, like, how can you that you can't change a person, you know, oh, this guy's 60 years old, he's not going to change his stripes. If he's somebody who wakes up and, you know, has coffee in the morning, how hard is it for that guy to change drinking coffee in the morning? Well, it's the same thing as society. It's so much more difficult for society to change a way that it's become accustomed to operating. So it exists, Larry Kudlow. It exists as much as it did when Larry Kudlow was born.
Just to put a fine point on it, there's a controversy around the naming of these bases in the military that are named after Confederate leaders. The Army first said they're kind of open to changing that. Here's a little something from ABC.
Symbols of racism being torn down around the world. Demonstrators in Bristol, England, toppling this statue of a 17th century slave trader, then dumping him in the harbor.
I have to ask, why is there a statue of a 17th century slave trader to begin with? I don't know the details around it, but I mean, it just seems like an odd statue to have.
Yeah, it is. And there's a conversation to be had about these things. Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. He was a brilliant guy who wrote one of the greatest documents in certainly in recorded history. But he also had this complication of being a slave owner. So I don't know enough about this man in England. But you're right. I mean, a slave trader should not be recorded with that kind of reverence. I don't know. They're probably mitigating circumstances.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I mean, he was probably more than just a slave trader. He had some, some role in the community or whatever.
Pressure from protesters is creating action in America as well. In Jacksonville, Florida, a statue of a Confederate soldier standing on this pedestal since the 19th century, carted off by the city overnight.
This is a symbol of white supremacy and hate that was put up in the Jim Crow days, and black people know that.
Just moments ago, the city's mayor ordering all Confederate statues removed. Tonight, the U.S. Navy moving to ban all Confederate flags from public spaces. But some argue these monuments are a part of history. In Virginia, there's a stalemate over this monument to Robert E. Lee. The governor wants it gone, but a judge issuing an injunction against its removal. Protesters here in the U.K. marked this statue of Winston Churchill with graffiti, calling him a racist. And now organizers are out with a list of about 60 statues around the country that they're demanding be removed.
You know, you could say this also, Michael, about so many American presidents, right? I mean, Andrew Jackson was a heinous person. I mean, he was a genocidal horror show. Woodrow Wilson was horribly prejudiced, wasn't he? Bigoted?
Yes, he was, and he came from a WASP background where that was accepted, and the context of the times, as uncomfortable as that is, often dictates the way people react in certain ways. Look, Gone with the Wind, the film is being discussed right now. HBO Max pulling it from their roster in order to give it context because of how it portrayed the antebellum South. Well, it was made a long time ago, and the antebellum South was what it was. And I think that you can go too far with these things. I personally think the Gone with the Wind thing goes too far, but people I respect and like disagree with me on that. I just sort of think that with some of these people, it's important in modern history to honor the people that are alive now who have to live in the shadow of these statues. Nathan Bedford Forrest, a Confederate general, was also the founder or one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. His huge statue in Nashville at the state legislature there just said that they cannot remove that statue. So that's systemic racism. That's the system. That's the elected state legislature in Nashville saying you can't remove a statue that people want removed of a man who started the Ku Klux Klan. It's hard to compare all of them, but there do seem to be extremes in there.
Well, the president, as you might imagine, and the president's Donald Trump. Did you know that, Michael? That's amazing to me.
You ruined, I TiVoed election night, but you ruined it.
Yeah, I hate to be a spoiler. President Donald Trump said that his administration will not even consider, that's a quote, renaming military bases originally named after Confederate leaders. This is a day after the Army issued a statement saying that top military leaders were, quote, open to the discussion. It has been suggested, again, this is a quote, that we should rename as many as 10 of our legendary military bases, such as Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Fort Hood in Texas, Fort Benning in Georgia, etc. These monumental and very powerful bases have become part of a great American heritage and a history of winning, victory, and freedom. That's what the president tweeted.
Yeah, I mean, this is an election year, and the president knows what his base is, and I'm not going to argue with the way he plays politics because it worked so well that he's the president, but it is certainly an ugly politics that a lot of people want to see gone. Even to capitalize on that in a way, the fact that he's able to capitalize on it is more disturbing than the fact that he chooses to. And I think that there's going to be an examination of this stuff. When you have the Army behind it, that usually means the trend will take it to getting those bases renamed. Even if you have a president who immediately does not want to do it, sometimes they will end up following the will of the military and certainly the will of the people at some point.
You make a really great point about the fact that you can even get altitude on that politically by taking that hardline stance speaks to the huge chunk of the country that still has a serious problem with racism.
Yeah, and that's systemic racism because that's the system and that's where racism is. It couldn't be more blatant.
Michael Shure, what happened in the Georgia primary results and in that election that was extended? Maybe summarize what happened down there. They had to extend the voting hours.
Yeah, I mean, quickly, but Georgia bought 250 new voting machines to try and streamline the way they vote after having many problems in 2016, 2018. Brad Raffensperger's the Secretary of State to Governor Brian Kemp, who won in 2018. Kemp is the former Secretary of State. They're both Republicans, and many, many polling places were closed. Many didn't work. And then they thought, okay, well, let's get these new voting machines in. Well, the combination of COVID, the combination of the will not really being there, and the combination of the fact that they had so many more people voting than were expected really caused such delays in Georgia that they're going to have to rethink all of it as they head into a runoff now that they're going to have for the Senate seat in August. And then, of course, in about 150 days, the presidential election. So it was really a disaster, but it was a disaster that I guess is better that it happened in June than it happens in November. But there is not a great oversight and not great will to have that oversight in the elections in Georgia.
Well, at least Georgia doesn't have any history of problems with elections, huh?
No, there's none at all. Yeah, so it's you got to give them a mulligan here because they've never had anything like this before. I will say though that Georgia is now a state that is in play both for the Senate and the presidential election, which it hasn't been in a while. So it matters. I mean, it always matters. So to say it matters more now is ridiculous. So I correct that. But it matters in a different way now than has mattered in the past because it could impact major results in how we are governed for the next 4 years.
Wasn't there an election that was essentially stolen from Stacey Abrams? I mean, maybe that overstates it, but it did seem as though certainly the facts around Stacey Abrams, she was running for governor there, right?
Yeah, there are a lot of people that don't think you're overstating it. Brian Kemp was running while he was Secretary of State of Georgia, was running as a Republican for governor against Stacey Abrams, who was the Democrat. Brian Kemp did not recuse himself from being Secretary of State, even as he stood for election as governor, thereby controlling all of the voting in the state. So he
right. That's the key thing. As Secretary of State, he had control of the vote.
Yeah, exactly. And irregularities, polling stations, the absentee ballots, registration, provisional ballots. So across the board, he oversaw that. And Stacey Abrams said many people were struck from the voting rolls who should have been able to vote. Many people weren't able to vote because polling places were closed or moved without notice. And many absentee ballots didn't get out to those who were looking to vote absentee. It was a fiasco, and that's why a lot of people think that he is the illegitimate governor of Georgia. But he is the governor of Georgia now, and he has another Republican Secretary of State, Raffensperger, we talked about just now, who won, who didn't see an emergent need, who was proud of the way the voting went. Look, a lot of the problems are in Fulton County, Georgia, which is where Atlanta is, and the counties around Fulton. But those, they have 150 counties in Georgia, and on primary day this Tuesday, there were problems in every single county. And a lot of it was related to COVID. Volunteers who are often elderly not wanting to come in, people who didn't have the right passwords for these new remote voting machines. So there are lots of problems, but Georgia has not attended to them.
Wow. Before we leave, or as we leave, I want to try to find something a little...
How about something fun? Is there something
That's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm looking for. Michael Shure, COVID-19 is serious, and as you've kind of suggested.
Looking for something like, Michael Shure, COVID-19.
Yeah, well, it's serious, but that doesn't mean that some of the things that are workarounds on COVID-19 don't sort of raise an eyebrow. And Hollywood is reopening. The studios were closed. They're reopening this week. And one of the problems is they have to shoot stuff with intimate scenes, even if it's not a sex scene. It may just be intimate conversations. And they have to shoot them in such a way that they can still respect social distancing. I mean, this is really it's mandated to be that way. And so what they're suggesting, and certainly this goes for sex scenes also, and these were also carved out as something they'd have to do, they may have to CGI it all.
Wow.
So close contact moments. In order to avoid transmission of COVID-19 between actors, they've issued a 22-page document from the Film Editors Association, and it suggested that these moments, including sex scenes and other intimate moments, must be either rewritten, abandoned, or produced using CGI.
That's bizarre. Yeah. Well, there's a joke in there about, in my 30s, all I had was CGI. But I don't know what the joke is, and it's not that. These are a sign of the times. I think, on the list of tragedies of COVID, it's the 111,000th.
Oh, yeah.
It's a big adjustment. It shows you that every single industry has had to adjust to this pandemic.
No, it's so true. It's so true.
Yeah.
The thing about this COVID-19 it seems as though every week there's something new, but it started as this, looked like a pulmonary thing. It was going to be the lungs, and you heard how awful it was, but now it looks like a disease of the circulatory system. It looks like there are huge issues involving vital organs, the central nervous system. And this is a far more dangerous, potentially, I would argue, far more dangerous disease than had originally been talked about.
Yeah, we clearly are learning as we go with COVID, and that's why this sort of cavalier attitude of just getting out there and living life again because you saw protesters and you got bored at home may not be the best advised way to go. But we're human beings, and I get why people want to get out there too.
Yeah, I think that's what's happening. People are just like, okay, I'm going to take my chances. Speaking of taking your chances, I saw in Vegas, and then I will let you go. My pals who are in Vegas say that everybody who's at the hotel at the Wynn, for example, they all have their masks on. Those people who work at the hotel. But the guests at the hotel in the main, in large numbers, do not have any kind of mask, nor is there any kind of social distancing. It kind of falls into your effort category. It's just like, I'll take my chances.
Yeah. Well, and that is the capital city of taking chances. So there you go.
Exactly. Ladies and gentlemen, he is ours, and we love him. Michael Shure.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks,
you. Michael. See ya.
This is Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. Mark Thompson is a huge loser. His show, weak, soft. I'm not a good friend of his. But if you're interested in crap and you're a communist, you can go to edge-show.com. I don't recommend it.
David Dayen, the executive editor of the American Prospect, his work and his writings and his research revealing, especially in these days of the pandemic, about corporate America and what I have called the biggest looting of the American treasury in American history. David Dayen, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Your piece at the American Prospect it's related to something that I've been really troubled by, and we've known in broad terms for a while, which is that this care package, this immense bailout, has been a top-down bailout. Mm-hmm. But when you really put the dots on the I's and the crosses on the T's, you see how enormously lopsided it is. Can you speak to that for a second? And then I've got some specific questions about companies and sort of the way it's set up.
Yeah, so I think what's most remarkable about this is how the systems are set up in this country such that our special class of investors and elites can be rescued from any kind of shock to the economic system just by sort of nods and signals. So the Federal Reserve on March 23rd, when the anticipation of the COVID-19 crisis was most acute on Wall Street and stocks were falling, bonds were dying, it was difficult to actually get borrowing done, credit was seizing up, and the Fed made an announcement. In so many words, they said, we're going to do whatever it takes to protect you, the investor. And they said they were going to, do a variety of asset purchases in order to assist the financial system. And the new one, the one they had never done before in their history, was saying they were going to purchase corporate bonds. So corporations borrow money, they put that into a bond that is sold to investors at a certain interest rate, and it was becoming difficult for corporations to actually pull that off. And then the Fed said, well, we'll backstop the market. We'll buy a bunch of corporate bonds. And the CARES Act gave them the money and the wherewithal to be able to do so. And after that point, the stock market has gone up 35%. The bond markets have opened to the degree that over $1 trillion in corporate borrowing has been issued this year, and we're only in May. And last year, it took till about late November to get to $1 trillion in corporate borrowing. If you look at funds, exchange-traded funds that are tied to corporate bonds, they all go way, way down, and then March 23rd hits, and they go all the way back up to where they were in February. It is incredible. And what's amazing about it is the Fed only said they would buy corporate bonds. To date, they have bought maybe $2 billion, which is nothing. I mean, this is a multi-trillion-dollar market. They've just by signaling and announcing that they will do whatever it takes has nursed these markets back to health and allowed companies that should, by all rights, have no business borrowing money at this point. Companies like Carnival Cruises and hotel chains and Herbalife, the multi-level marketing company, they've all been able to scoop up tons of money. And they're inflating these assets of stock prices and bond ETFs and things like that. They're inflating these assets through this signal. And the question becomes, well, what happens when everybody finds out that these companies are insolvent? What becomes of all this borrowing? Did the Federal Reserve, in trying to save the system, create more financial instability and perhaps another financial crisis in the process?
You said so much, and I just want to follow up on a few things. The desire to stop the bleeding on Wall Street created this moment where they said, hey, don't worry, guys, we're not going to let you bleed out. And as you say, then the market rallied. But you also said something else I want to just touch on. You mentioned Carnival Cruise Lines, and I don't know if you mentioned the airlines, but the airlines are in there too, right? I think you mentioned Boeing. Let's just speak to that for a moment. So for people listening who go, well, how come you wouldn't bail out? Aren't those businesses that deserve to be getting bailouts of some sort?
Well, the standard sort of description of this, there was an economist with the last name Badgeho, and it says, lend freely against good collateral at a penalty rate. And that's what you do in a crisis. You definitely turn on the spigots, but you're supposed to get some collateral for it. and you're supposed to make sure that you get a satisfactory interest rate. So Carnival Cruises, which has no sort of social productivity whatsoever.
Well, and they're tax avoiders, aren't they?
Isn't a U.S. company, doesn't pay much U.S. taxes, has very few U.S. employees. They were searching around to find a way to get some cash into their coffers to weather the storm here. And hedge funds were going to give them money at a 15% interest rate. And then the Fed said, we're going to bail out the system. And then they were able to get borrowing for as low as 5%, some of it at 11%, but some of it at as low as 5%. And if you put that together, that's an implicit subsidy to Carnival Cruise Lines, which, as you said, doesn't pay a lot of taxes, doesn't have a lot of U.S. employees, for it's hundreds of millions of dollars in value to Carnival. Now, you look at something like Boeing. This is even more acute. Boeing had a special deal within the CARES Act where it would have access to some lending facilities, but it would have to promise not to fire workers. In other words, that money would go to payroll. And after the Fed restarted the credit markets, Boeing was able to do $25 billion in corporate bonds and refill their treasury. And just this week, Boeing announced 12,000 layoffs. So by avoiding the federal dollars that were available to it that would have come with strings not only in terms of requiring payrolls to be maintained, but also probably some equity upside for the U.S. taxpayer. In other words, we get part of Boeing. Instead, the Fed ran it through the capital markets, no conditions whatsoever, and Boeing now is firing workers left and right while taking billions of dollars in borrowing. So the question here is that this is a congressional problem. This is Congress's fault. The Fed is just doing what it does. It is the lender of last resort. It provides liquidity to the markets, and that's how it plays its game.
If Congress cared about this or the way it should have worked, they were rushing this bill through, but they should have built provisions in that would have prevented this. That would have kept the American taxpayer connected.
Correct. Two things. They should have put some conditionality and mandated it into these purchases that Treasury or the Fed or whoever was going to do, so that we actually get out of this bailout what we want, which is stabilization of families. We don't care about companies being stabilized necessarily. We care about families. We care about workers being stabilized. Instead, this money is being sucked up, and some companies have said explicitly it's going to be used on stock buybacks to give back to investors. It's going to be used on mergers and acquisitions, purchasing sick companies. It's going to be used on executive salaries and bonuses, and workers are going to get the shaft. So why do you want to facilitate that? If Congress was an important point at which they were needed to push this through, Congress could have set some conditions. That's number one. And number two is really the disproportionality. So corporate America gets this massive bailout. The wealth value market capitalization in the stock market is $7 trillion above the low. So $7 trillion of wealth was created for investors. On the other side, we have temporary relief that is given through unemployment and one-time $1,200 checks and things like that is going to just go away very soon, at the end of July in the case of the expanded unemployment. So workers, individuals, small businesses all got crumbs, temporary relief, while corporate America got a money cannon pointed in its direction and has ramped that up to trillions of dollars in benefits. That's the problem.
And among the things that you mention, you talk about executive bonuses. You talk about corporate acquisition. I mean, the idea somehow that you're concerned with small business, but you're actually enabling these large corporations that are getting these bailouts to use that money for acquisition of struggling companies during this pandemic.
That's right. I mean, T-Mobile is a good example of this. They did a $19 billion bond issue. And this was, when we reopened these markets, this spigot on the corporate bond market, because companies were ailing and they needed this help to stay in business, we were told, so that they can pay their workers. Well, T-Mobile has said directly they're going to use that money to finance their purchase of Sprint, which was announced last year and is now going through. So this is creating this kitty of money that can be used to purchase weaker companies and consolidate the market. We already know that millions of small businesses are going to be, knocked out onto the street, and that market shares are going to get more and more concentrated at the top. Now, by unclogging these credit markets, you're going to allow these companies to go even further and buy up competitors.
The lack of supervision on where the money goes seems so nakedly clear. I mean, it was even in the signing document that Trump presented along with the bills and these various orders that crossed his desk and the packages that were all delivered from Congress. The one thing that was talked about was some kind of oversight, and then where did that oversight go? It seemed to evaporate in large measure.
So there are inspector generals. One group, the guy that was supposed to head that commission, sort of a consortium of inspectors general, was fired by Trump. The other one, which is special inspector general for the bailouts, was a guy who was a lawyer in the Trump White House. Do you think he's going to be looking very closely at this situation? And then you have this 5-member panel called the Congressional Oversight Commission, which Trump doesn't have any involvement in the hiring and firing of. However, they still don't have a chair. This is 2 months after the bill has been passed. Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi are supposed to agree on who's going to be the chair of this commission, and there is none. And they've put out one report, but they don't actually have leadership on this commission. They haven't called a hearing. They haven't done anything. And so this is a real problem. We do not have adequate oversight of this massive multi-trillion-dollar bailout of the largest corporations in America. And we're just sort of taking it on faith that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury will do the right thing. I'll give you an example of where they certainly didn't. The Fed put together another facility called the Main Street Lending Program. And now your conception of Main Street is going to have to be stretched here, because this facility can lend to companies that have as much as 15,000 employees. So that doesn't sound like Main Street to me, but that's what it is. So the initial terms for who they would lend to came out. And then the Fed got a bunch of letters from the oil and gas industry, from friendly senators like Ted Cruz, who are friendly with the oil industry, and from the U.S. Energy Secretary, saying you need to change the program, you need to tweak it so oil and gas companies who are already leveraged to the hilt and are not, they're going through an absolute crash right now, we want them to be able to get this money. So the Fed very quietly came out with changes to the system on April 30th, changes to the term sheet that was everything that was asked for by these oil and gas lobbyists and by Ted Cruz and by the Energy Secretary. Every single thing was in the change to the term sheet. And it's very obvious that they changed it at the direction of the oil and gas lobby. And that's what we're getting out of this. And because there's no oversight, that is sort of on the back page of the business section, and nobody knows about it, nobody hears about it. But it's craven. It's a direct corruption.
You talk about also the bonds. You were mentioning them before, that essentially guaranteeing the bonds, promises to purchase corporate and municipal bonds. That actually was lifting the credit markets already, just that indication from the Fed. You also, in your piece, though, talk about junk bonds. I wonder if you'd explain what junk bonds are and how all of a sudden the junk bond market is now what we as a nation, as American taxpayers, are a part of, because that's what we're also involved in.
Yeah. So, it doesn't sound good, does it? Junk bonds.
No,
right?
junk bonds doesn't.
So there's a certain level at which bonds are rated for their credit worthiness. So we have these credit rating agencies that say, okay, it's pretty clear this company is going to be able to pay that money back, so we'll give them a AAA rating. And maybe this company will pay it back and maybe they won't, so we'll give them a B-plus rating. And then there are companies that it's very unlikely that they'll ever pay this money back, and we'll give them a junk bond rating. And obviously you get more in interest when you lend to companies with worse ratings, right? So these junk bond companies obviously were having a real hard time getting money. A lot of them were already highly leveraged. They were already borrowing a lot of money, and it didn't seem like they were going to be able to pay it back. And the Fed when they first announced on March 23rd they would buy corporate bonds, they said, we're only buying the good stuff. We're only buying the investment-grade bonds. On April 9th, they changed their tune and said, we will look into buying, they call them high-yield bonds. They use a different spin on the language, but that essentially means junk bonds. High yield refers to the interest rate, so that means junk bonds. And now the Fed is saying we're going to get involved in the junk bond market, and the junk bond market responded in the same way that the rest of the corporate bond market responded, and now there are lots and lots of bonds going out from companies that are rated as junk bonds. Companies like AMC Theaters, which aren't open, which haven't been open for 2 months, and the company is probably going to head into bankruptcy. A company like Hertz that already just got into bankruptcy, that's a junk bond company. Carnival, based on the interest rate that they ended up getting, is kind of in junk bond territory. So why is the Federal Reserve getting involved with taxpayer money in rescuing the junk bond market? It makes absolutely no sense to me. There's no social utility. There's no economic utility in having to do this. And the thing is that, the textbook definition of capitalism is that investors take risks and they get a high return if they take a risk and it pays off, but they know full well that they could lose that money if their risk goes south. And what we're saying essentially is that we're not going to allow that to happen, that we're not going to allow any downside risk to come upon a certain class of people. As it was said in my story, it's like socialism for capitalists. They have socialized the losses and privatized the gains. And what's interesting is that when you talk to people about this, the people most irritated by it are people who are involved with the financial industry. They understand this. They understand the distortions and the perversions of the system when you have this kind of thing go forward. And now, obviously, the COVID-19 crisis was not something that any company created. This is not like 2008, where the banks actually perpetrated the problem and then got bailed out. This is different. However, a lot of these junk bond companies were already sick, and they're just getting sort of caught up in the wave of rescuing that's going on. And I don't think there's a lot of reason why we should be doing that.
The last time it was corporate socialism where gains are privatized and the losses are in the bailout, that was 2008. It was a huge financial crisis where you essentially had these investment instruments being revealed as total frauds. And then we, the American taxpayer, we bail out those companies. We bailed out those investment groups. We bailed out those banks. Wasn't that probably the last huge example of it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So 2008 was definitely the model. And a lot of the things that were done in 2008 are being done now. Treasury is buying up mortgage-backed securities and other asset-backed securitizations. They are guaranteeing the money market, which in 2008 started to falter. And so they're putting the U.S. full faith and credit behind the money market system. They're running a very similar playbook, but they're going further in this crisis, which, maybe is worthwhile because this is obviously a bigger crisis than we saw in 2008. But I guess I would say that while it's different in terms of who is responsible, what's not different is the sort of moral hazard that it brings about. And what's really not different is the disproportionality. So the banks got bailed out and Main Street didn't, homeowners didn't in 2008. And this time around, you have this temporary relief based on creaky systems like state unemployment systems that make it hard for you to actually get your claim in. And, the IRS, which maybe is getting you your stimulus check and maybe isn't. So people have to scratch and claw to get this temporary relief. And then if you're behind the velvet rope of the Federal Reserve, they'll just nod in your direction and your bank account will be restored to its former glory. So, I think it's a real problem from a societal aspect, and it may not, another thing that I bring up in the piece is that it may not even work. Loans do not replace income. And as long as there's no income going into these corporations, all the loans in the world aren't going to do a whole lot of good. So we may have just inflated these prices only to see them deflate in the very near future. And at that point, we'll have pushed more debt into this system, raised a bigger debt bubble, only to see it pop. And that's a danger.
Wow. I want to read just a paragraph from your piece, David Dayen. To properly assess the virtues of the rescue, you have to set it in context. This is a little of what you just said.
Yeah.
To properly assess the virtues of the rescue, you have to set it in context. The unemployment rate is 14.7% and rising. Car lines for food banks stretch for miles. As Americans continue to struggle and lose ground, the nation's investment elite have been thus far saved from any downside of the coronavirus crisis. Beneficiaries are largely confined to stockholders, bondholders, and corporate executives who are often major stockholders. Workers are not only not protected, they're paying for the rescue with taxpayer money propping up the Fed actions. This is a massive wealth transfer to owners of financial assets. And you go on with it's what you said, because the moral imperative, it would seem, to help so many struggling Americans through this pandemic. It's even more galling when you see the completely directed corporate and elite nature of this bailout.
Yeah, it really is. And, we've all seen that picture, I believe it was CNBC, of Jim Cramer, and he has a graphic on his monitor that says, best week for Wall Street since 1938. And then underneath it, on the chyron, on the lower third, it says 16 million people out of work. And that dichotomy in historically has produced social unrest. When you give all the gains to one small segment of society, the 99%, as it were, gets a little upset. And I don't think it's sustainable to only have a bailout for the rich and powerful and leave everybody else behind. It's just not sustainable. Yet, that's kind of where we're headed. Now, the boosted unemployment insurance is kind of keeping that at bay for the moment, but that runs out on July 31st. And then we might really reap the whirlwind here. We might see what the New York Times called an avalanche of evictions. We have held off through forbearance the foreclosures that are sure to follow. Along with that, we already are seeing increased food insecurity. I think that could continue as food prices at the grocery store go up and up. It's just not sustainable. And, when you run your policymaking through a central bank rather than engaging in real fiscal policy and doing the kind of things that Franklin Roosevelt did in the New Deal, you're going to get a biased action that is tilted towards the wealthy and well-connected. I mean, it's inherent into the Fed's practice. You almost can't blame the Fed because this is the structure that it's set up to handle. And it's really on the fact that our policymakers decided to defer. And when they deferred, they put it in the hands of an entity that inherently is going to drift towards one class of people.
Right. They're just there to produce liquidity. And it's funny, Congress, you're saying, really had the power. Why did that can get kicked down the road?
Well, I think Congress likes to defer responsibility habitually. We've seen this in the foreign policy realm. They allow the president to dictate foreign policy and then carp about it after the fact. They've done this on surveillance. They allow the CIA, the NSA to do what it wants and then maybe yell about it after a fact, but retroactively make it illegal. And now we're seeing it in the domestic fiscal policy realm. They would rather have somebody else take the reins. They don't want to govern. They don't want to take responsibility. This should have been a political problem that was solved through democratic means. Should not have gone to a somewhat shadowy, not very transparent central bank that's quasi-public and quasi-private with the authority to work at their discretion on who they bail out and who they don't. Congress should have done this in a democratic way, and they just failed.
Well, and the guy who is in charge at the Switch, Steve Mnuchin, he has this eerie connection to 2008, doesn't he? Wasn't he the...
He's the Treasury Secretary, yeah.
No, he's the Treasury Secretary, but he was the, what do they call him, the foreclosure king? I think there was something like that. Because
they call him the foreclosure king. That was when he was at One West Bank, where he was chairman for a while. And they would foreclose on people and sign affidavits attesting the foreclosure and spending 30 seconds on the documents. And they would foreclose on people over as little as, 20 cents of an underpayment. So One West was definitely a bad actor in 2008. And it's a rich irony that now the person who is, besides Jerome Powell, who's the chairman of the Federal Reserve, arguably the most powerful policymaker in the world, was tied to that 2008 mess, and now is running the rescue in 2020.
David Dayen, is there a way out of this, or has the hole been dug so deep? Of course, some of the digging was because of the situation from the pandemic, but also, as you suggest, to the favoritism, the corporate favoritism, the elite nature of this entire bailout. It's loathsome and it's just grotesque. But anyway, now that the hole is what it is, for all these reasons, is there a way out?
Well, I do think that the pandemic allows an opportunity. I mean, I think that the cracks in the system have been exposed. We're now calling workers who were once invisible, we're now calling them essential. We are seeing how our systems are inadequate to provide relief. We're seeing the fact that a good number of people, maybe half of all Americans, couldn't afford a $400 emergency. We're seeing the consequences of that, the dire need, immediate need, as soon as systems are disrupted. And we have the opportunity to turn that into action to make sure that doesn't happen again. So, there's an election coming up, and, these are the conditions historically that do create radical transformation and change. I mean, we saw this in the 1930s. What the Depression did in terms, and it was really a bottom-up action. That's the thing that you have to say about the Depression that's important, is that it wasn't just Franklin Roosevelt getting in and making a bunch of changes at his will. It was the people demanding it. I always give this example of this guy named Francis Townsend, who's kind of been lost to history, but he was a retired individual who wrote a letter to the editor to the Long Beach Press-Telegram saying that what we should do for older people, I'm tired of seeing too many old people scrounging around in garbage looking to get fed, we should provide old age insurance, a set benefit for people who work their entire lives. And he got Townsend clubs set up all over the country, and this is in the 1930s, by the way. And he got a petition sent to Washington with 20 million signatures on it within 2 years of him writing this letter to the editor in 1933. And eventually that was turned into Social Security. And, the organic, I think, activism and demands that are going to come from below in the wake of this crisis can be turned into action. It's going to take persistence and will on the part of the people to demand those solutions and force the political system to act.
David, before I let you go, I want to ask you about something that seemed to make sense to me from the very beginning. I'm not a Trump fan, and to state it in the extreme, but I felt one of the things he could have done, because he had such a strong following, in places I never thought he would, really among the GOP rank and file. I thought that Trump could have brought forward some kind of infrastructure plan to at least employ a lot of Americans, to make good on a promise. I understand they wanted to rush through the tax cut, and that's one of the reasons we're in the hole we're in. But also, with that political capital that he had initially, I felt some good could happen from this presidency that just seemed to me to be this awful perversion of history. So anyway, what I'm asking you is, now, could that exist with unemployment as it is? Could some sort of public works program mannered, if you will, on the FDR years to which you just referred, could that exist today in some form?
Look, we know that one of the ways that we are going to be able to reopen this economy is through what they call contact tracing, right? And that is figuring out who has the virus, figuring out who they interacted with over the previous 10 days, finding those people and making sure they isolate as well. And that's how you eventually get to a position where you preserve the economy for everybody else. Well, that requires, millions of people, right? I mean, that requires a large amount of people, and there are millions of people out of work. So this is tailor-made for a public works program along the lines of the Civilian Conservation Corps, where you have a national public health corps that in this time when we need contact tracers, you hire, train, and send out people to, and largely it's a job of being on the phone and finding people and telling them, hey, you interacted with somebody who might, who has COVID-19, and we think that you should isolate for 14 days and until it leaves your system. That's just a no-brainer to me, that we have a lot of unemployed and we have a job that needs filling, and let's put those two together. So those opportunities are available to us, and they're going to continue to be available even after this ends, and we should take them.
David Dayen, The American Prospect, where he's executive editor. You can read this piece. I will link to it on our website, edge-show.com. And in whatever platform you're listening, actually, you'll see a link there, and you can click right through and you can read David's piece. You also have a book coming out, don't you, later this summer?
Yeah, July 21st. It's called Monopolized, Life in the Age of Corporate Power. And it was written before the crisis, but I think it has a lot of resonance afterwards as well.
Well, let's talk again then. Really enjoyed it. David Dayen, thanks so much.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode. I think David Dayen is, he's the real thing. And of course, Michael is always the real thing and brings it every time he appears. If you want to reach us, edgewithmarkthompson@gmail.com. And until next time, bye-bye.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for supporting Mark Thompson here on the Edge Radio. Fantastic show with all the jokes and commentary and the politics and the bullshit. You can listen on iTunes or Stitcher, or you can just go to the damn website, edge-show.com. Stupid. Why is there a dash?